I'm delighted to be able to be here to hear the witness testimonies. And when you hear Diana Lopez's testimony and Carlos Vecchio's testimony, then you appreciate the dimensions and the depths of the massive domestic repression in Venezuela, the widespread and systematic violation of human rights, the denial of the rule of law, the culture of corruption and impunity, etc., all the things that they have put so compellingly and graphically before you. And I'm delighted that they will be in Ottawa tomorrow to testify before our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Human Rights so that parliamentarians can get a better appreciation and understanding of what is happening in Venezuela. And this brings me to the particular points that I want to share with you today. The question that I want to put is really, what can Canada, what can Canadian parliamentarians, what can you do in order to advance the case and cause of Leopoldo Lopez and the cause of human rights and democracy and the rule of law in Venezuela? And for reasons of time, because I've been cautioned by my colleague René Provost with regard to time, I'm going to leave out all the things I was going to do because it's no longer necessary about analyzing what happened in Venezuela. You have all the, as I say, the witness testimony best put forward without any derivative testimony from myself. I'm just going to speak mainly to the question of action, and I'm going to try to do that through the prism of the Leopoldo Lopez case as a case study of how to mobilize awareness, understanding, and action. And I hope you'll pardon me for doing it in point form, but again, for reasons of time. And the first thing is we need to engage and involve the Canadian government in the overall, as I say, awareness and action with what is happening in Venezuela. I have to tell you that, frankly, the Canadian government, Venezuela, is not on the radar screen of the Canadian government. They are involved and preoccupied with issues relating to ISIS, with regarding to international terrorism. I can go on. Venezuela, regrettably, is not on the radar screen, though it should be a foreign policy priority for us for all the reasons that you can appreciate. So we have tried to use the Leopoldo Lopez case because when you put a face on what is going on, when you put a particular appreciation of the pain and plight of political prisoners using Leopoldo Lopez as a case study, then you can somehow connect with the government. And so we had Leon Tentori, Leopoldo's wife, come to Parliament in November, meet with our Foreign Affairs Minister, John Baird, which resulted in him making the first real public statement for advocacy and action on behalf of the Canadian government. And that served as the beginning of a wake-up call for the Canadian government. And I have a few other recommendations on this particular point. I'll even go to the second one, and that is involvement of the Canadian Parliament and Canadian parliamentarians. Here too, Leopoldo Lopez's case has proven to be a kind of mobilizing framework for our advocacy. We had, as I said, the presence of Lilian Tantori and Jared Genzer, who's been the counsel for Leopoldo Lopez. I work with him as co-counsel, but he has been the principal counsel. They came, they testified before our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee. They met with parliamentarians, as a result of which we've established an all-party parliamentary committee on behalf of Leopoldo Lopez. We held a press conference in November. Unfortunately, it coincided with the very day that there were allegations of sexual harassment against certain parliamentarians, so very few came to our press conference. And as I spoke to the media, I said to them, I thought that you guys can walk and chew gum at the same time. They said, no, we have another story like we had. We're sorry we couldn't get, but we're going to have another press conference tomorrow. I have to say here too, the Canadian press has been lagging way behind our American counterparts. You've had the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street, etc., writing not only major news stories, but writing supportive editorials. Yeah. You can scan the Canadian media, you won't find it. We're hoping that that can happen, and here's where you yourselves can engage in terms of social media, your own op-ed writing, and begin to help engage the media. The third point here in this regard is for the Canadian government and
corresponding to the service you wish to reach, or press 0 to reach the McGill telephone operator.
Okay. The third point is to involve the Canadian government and the Canadian Parliament to use our bilateral relationship, our commercial relationship and leverage with regard to Venezuela, but all the institutions, the OAS, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the Inter-American Charter, et cetera, to leverage what is happening in Venezuela, to help mobilize the international community in that regard, and to enact sanctions. We should be enacting sanctions against the human rights violators in Venezuela, the way the American Congress recently did in terms of identifying those people who have been the major human rights violators, the main people involved in domestic repression, and invoke travel bans, asset seizures, including those that may be here in Canada and have assets here in Canada. A fourth approach, and that is to internationalize the advocacy, and that is to build an international critical mass of advocacy on behalf of Leopoldo Lopez, and through the looking glass of his case, a critical mass of international advocacy with regard to what is happening and the need for redressing the human rights violations in Venezuela. And here we have made representations to and received support from the European Parliament, Latin American parliamentarians, UN agencies, the UN Commissioner on Human Rights, President Obama, etc. We have not had as much in terms of Canada in that regard. And again, I emphasize that we need to ratchet up the Canadian leadership in this approach. Fifth is the mobilization of the media. I made reference to that, and here you guys can make a real contribution to that. The sixth thing is UN agencies. We petitioned the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. They came up with a finding of fact, a conclusion of law, that Leopoldo Lopez's detention has been arbitrary, illegal, called immediately for his release. This is something that we can build on. As well, we have made representations to the 6 UN special rapporteurs. There are UN special rapporteurs on human rights defenders, on arbitrary detention, on freedom of expression. I can go on. And we are seeking now to get the 6 UN special rapporteurs to issue a joint statement calling for his release and building upon, as I say, the decision of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. A seventh thing is we have prepared a legal brief, a very compelling, documented witness testimony and legal analysis of the violations of the human rights of Leopoldo Lopez in this case, which serve as a case study for the violations of all the other political prisoners. And Leopoldo Lopez has said he will not leave prison until all the political prisoners are released. This white paper is something particularly law students can use. It's close to 100 pages of detailed, comprehensive, documented witness testimony and legal analysis with the kind of footnoted things that I thought I had gotten away from in no longer being a law professor, but this is something that I think you guys can use in terms of an advocacy brief in that regard. An eighth thing is making representations, and we are doing so to inter-parliamentary groups like the Inter-Parliamentary Union, Liberal International. A ninth is working with NGOs, again, to build up a critical mass of involvement by civil society and the principal NGOs, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Advancing Human Rights Freedom Now, all those with whom we have been working in this regard. The 10th, and moving to a close, making representations to bar associations, because we've got to engage the Canadian Bar Associations, provincial bar associations. I'll be meeting with the Law Society of Upper Canada next week, with the Quebec Bar and so on, to engage the legal community in the cases of the political prisoners in Venezuela, and again, using Leopoldo Lopez's case, because it's a classic case study in that regard. Finally, making direct representations to Venezuela, to its government and the like. And may I close just by saying that none of this could have been possible without the courageous involvement of Leopoldo Lopez's family. With regard to his mother, his sister, the whole family has been engaged, and the Venezuelan diaspora. And I want to pay tribute to the Venezuelan diaspora, some of whom are also coming tomorrow, the leadership of the diaspora, who will be appearing before the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, meeting with Canadian parliamentarians and the like. And in terms of what you here in the law school can do, let me just close with several suggestions, one-liners, really. When I was a law professor here, we used to every year take on the case of a political prisoner. and we'd mobilize the law school community on behalf of that political prisoner to engage in all the things that I've been mentioning and the like. We did this with Anatoly Sharansky, who was in the former Soviet Union. We did it with regard to Nelson Mandela. I want to suggest to you, take on the case of Leopoldo Lopez. Make this a case where this McGill Law School, the McGill community, adopts Leopoldo Lopez as a political prisoner and makes case and cause on his behalf. As well, there is a... There is a procedure in Parliament whereby a parliamentarian can table a petition that is signed by 25 people, and table it in Parliament, and when it's tabled in Parliament, can make a statement on the behalf of that petition and the like. All I can say is you have amongst you here groups of people who can organize petitions, give it not just to me, to other parliamentarians. Every time a parliamentarian tables that petition, he or she can make a statement about it. Every time I make a statement about it, that thing goes into the record. Not that Hansard is a bestseller, but I'm just saying it's another way of mobilization of awareness and action. Use the social media, do op-eds, as I mentioned, work with the Venezuelan diaspora, and as Diana said, use the testimonies. These testimonies are really the best evidence we have as to the massive repression going on in Venezuela and our individual and collective responsibility to address it, redress it, and bring about democratization and human rights for the Venezuelan people. Thank you.